Chapter 67. Claire Rook Vesperia. Most would find themselves in a bewilderment if they found themselves falling from the sky at an ever-increasing rate. One might assume that it was a dream or some sort of illusion of the mind. In the case of Hecate, she always assumed the worst. Firstly, the fact that she suddenly found herself mid-air was easily accepted. She had been summoned, had she? Secondly, the person doing the summoning was an old friend of hers, Meredith. Of course, she did not work out the details of how she got summoned, but she could guess that it might have involved marking his soul and his bloodline with her magic. The mark of the witch goddess bound him, whether he knew it or not. His children would belong to her, and at a time of her choosing, so would he. With the mark on his soul, she could spy on him, or even call him to her. But the converse was also possible. He could in fact summon her if he knew how. He didn't. He wouldn't be able to, yet here she was. Had he simply said her name 3 times? No, she would have been able to accept or decline the summoning. In this case, she was brought before him instantly and by powerful magic. She couldn't precisely name the magic, but if she had a moment she might be able to figure it out. She was midair, in the sky. Meredith was now holding on to her. There was no ground to draw a summoning circle or perform a ritual summoning. He was not a mage. He did not personally possess the ability or knowledge to summon her. And considering it was mid-air, it was rather a tricky business performing a summon. How he himself got in the sky was unknown to her as well. Ultimately, she came up with a relatively quick understanding of a rather complicated puzzle. You have a powerful ally helping you, one who has strength and knowledge enough to do this. Meredith couldn't speak and didn't know how to send mental messages back, but the look on his face said he wasn't really sure who was helping him, nor would he be the type to care. The weapon he carried with him? Again, that was something Meredith did not nor could make. She at first assumed the nobles of Xing were able to come up with something. They created some new weapon, but she knew now this was not so. Considering that Meredith was able to summon her in the sky, this was not the work of Xing. No, he was getting other help she needed to consider before immediately killing him. Now begged the question where she was falling. She was being held. She couldn't move her arms. He was holding them. His black blade was still on his back. He intended to fight her. "The fall could kill you," he shouted with his eyes covered by goggles, his skin covered by as much cloth as he could have. Falls from this height were cold generally, but it seemed like he went out of his way to cover up all of his skin. The fall? Kill her? She thought not. A goddess did not die from falls. She called upon her magic as she fell, sensing the area she was in. Where was she? Where was this? It seemed as if magic itself was in complete disarray. She could try to cast a spell to fly or even float, but this flux of magic would make it impossible. Under a lot of circumstances, many casters and magus would die, but she was no mere caster or magus. Worry did not even strike her. It was no mere act of courage. She simply was not in danger. The fall? I expected better. In truth, she didn't expect them to even try to kill her, but if they were going to, they needed to do a lot better, resorting to speaking to his mind when the wind kicked too hard to make the words audible. He gripped her tight as she saw the storm in the black sand of where they were falling. It was rapidly approaching. He was able to respond to her mind. He did not know how exactly he could. "Well, did you expect that?" he said, still holding on to her, as he fell to the black desert of Blackmaw, where the stronger the caster, the more potent the poison of the dark dust. Alice called it nephelite. It would eat into her, it would disrupt her magic. Even simple spells would become useless. The ability to fly, float, or teleport away would be impossible. Of course, Hecate teleporting was far more difficult than teleporting a simple man like Meredith. The amount of magic in Hecate was staggering. She was a goddess. Nothing simple could summon her. Least of all near here. They were getting help of the divine sort. She was now sure of it. To summon her right above Blackmaw, with a spell she did not know? To any other caster it would have been a death sentence. But she was a goddess. The storms of Blackmaw would not be enough to stop her magic completely. "Who made that seal on your back, I wonder?" she said to his mind, smiling as the unforgiving ground came closer and closer as they fell. He figured telling her wouldn't be any real harm, considering he didn't know himself. A little gem with the voice of a child etched it on my back. She might have not believed him ordinarily, but she marked him. Her magic even here could detect no untruth. Further, she knew him enough to doubt he'd lie like that. He would have to come up with something better, interesting, A spell etched on his back? There was a deity at work for sure. Still, she had to put an end to this nonsense. Before they hit the ground, her eyes pulsed silver, and the floating bits of dark dust and wind slowed them to a stop. All of the kicking wind and swirling sand slowly stopped, and as did their fall. They slowly came to a complete halt midair. He hugged her as they hovered just above the ground. There was no deadly fall, and there was no dramatic fall to their deaths. "Really?" Hecate said. "You thought a fall would kill me?" "No," Meredith said, "but this place might." The spell she made that stopped the fall ended. The spell was torn apart and pushed away. The kicking black sand continued and touched her. The particles that were hard to feel at first, after some focus, could become harmful. The amount of magic she has caused the sand to become even more deadly. It pained her to admit it was even to her a threat. Then an arrow went sailing into her, hooked into her flesh. Some 80 paces away was Scipio pointing a bow right at her, readying to loose another arrow instantly using dominant hand shooting. He loosed another arrow, and she simply sidestepped beyond mortal speed. Meredith lunged at her with a black blade. She dodged that as well and grit her teeth. No doubt she could kill them. Easily best them. She swung her staff and clanked it against Meredith's blade. He slid back. She was far stronger than she looked, especially for her size. She should not have the force she demonstrated. He went skidding back a long way, and it was a crushing blow. Magic infused with her attack. The dark dust, while powerful, worked less well on spells that were instant or were inside the body. Getting hit by her staff could prove fatal. Next she stopped another arrow with her eyes dilated yet again. The arrow stopped mid-air, and then she responded by sending a simple bolt flying towards him. He moved away, grabbing a cloak and holding over himself. It had some magical resistance, but he barely needed it. As the bolt traveled through the storm, it grew smaller, and bits of it began to break apart. The speed of the attack slowed, until at last the bolt had to travel such a distance most of it dissipated. Most, but not all. A small fragment hit Scipio, and that was enough to send him skidding. One had to wonder if she was able to use full power, how strong that attack might be. Darius stood inside the observatory in the center of the diamond panel. Using the observatory, he was able to not only watch the battle, but to interfere directly with the conflict. The observer had said that he could teleport people, a grand total of 10 times. The first time he teleported the entire party out of Blackmaw. After a month of preparation, Darius and his company returned, with Meredith, Augustana, Scipio, and 24 Blackblade wielders. Sai was present as well. At first, the plan was simple: to teleport Meredith using the observer above Blackmaw, and to activate the summoning of Hecate. The symbol on this back had all of the magic it needed to summon her, and once saying her full name 3 times, he could summon her midair. As they fell, they would get closer to Blackmaw, making it impossible for her to teleport away, or she'd quickly learn that casting some sort of flight magic would be temporary at best. After they landed, Meredith would engage as best he could. What magic was that? How did she avoid dying from the fall? He figured, her being a witch goddess, that she'd have something, but no one knew what it was she was doing. The observer responded after a brief analysis. Ars Momentus. It's a magic that targets the momentum and force of a targeted area, slowing it or speeding it up. In this case, she used it to slow her fall and stop the winds of iron sand. However, the black maw will end the spell. It will dissipate before she can make a lasting defense. She can use it to block melee attacks and arrows so long as she casts the spell before the impact or slow incoming projectile-based spells. "Scipio, 80 paces north of her! Teleport him!" Darius shouted. The observer was ready. Understood. It was done. Scipio vanished in a quick flash of light. Her attention was focused on Meredith. She would not be able to send Scipio magically or see him in the storm. The arrow hitting its mark was asking much. The storm and wind were a bind on any archer. However, Scipio managed to hit the mark, even if it was no shot through the neck. At first, she seemed like she was ready to kill him, but the distance was great enough where the spell would not likely hit him. He readied another arrow, using a rapid-fire technique combined with physical magic. Normal humans would not be able to react, but he had a feeling she would. Hoping Darius would send him back up soon, but before that, he hoped that she might take the bait. Hecate considered following the archer, closing the distance between the two of them, then ending him. However, after 2 steps, she realized the problem with that logic. He was guiding her away from the edge of Blackmaw. If she gave chase to him, he might lead her in circles for as long as he could. He was immortal, he had very little magic. It was possible that the storm could kill him. But she, as a goddess, had so much more to lose. The storm was eating into her, the iron sand pressing to her skin little by little, the particles adding up. She needed to leave Black Maw as soon as possible. The humans were not a threat to her, but this place was. She knew not what the iron sand was. It could not truly be called metal, nor sand. It was not alive, not any more. Some kind of ash. No, she did not have time to consider this. She turned her body and went the opposite direction of Scipio, heading to the closest exit of Black Maw. She was not so foolish as to chase a single mortal in circles. True, he might fire his arrows at her, and true, they might be cold iron or even black steel, but time itself was her enemy. She needed to leave. She could kill him easily once she was out of the storm of the maw. Meredith got up with a groan, backing off from her. Did they think her dead already? Foolish mortals, she could focus the power in her body and slowly attempt to eject the particles from her body. It was painful and mentally exhausting, but she could do it if she focused. As she walked, she slowly began the process, keeping her focus on purging the spots of magic distorting buildup. She considered making a cloak out of magic, or summoning one, but she doubted even she could make one that would last in the storm. Summoning one would be problematic as well, since she couldn't really target one. Taking one from an enemy would take too much time. She needed to leave. Black Blades, get ready. She may be a goddess, but she won't see you coming. You could die, but so can she. Everything dies. Darius was getting their pep talk ready. The Black Blades chanted back. Everything dies. Even goddesses can bleed. Observer, teleport them directly next to Hikatai as best you can. All 23 of them, Darius said. The observer blinked a light, and the men flashed away 2 or 3 at a time. The quick burst of light was all that remained of them, leaving only Darius, Sai, and Augustana. Observer, document the ability Ars Momentus and let us know at a later date if it can be replicated. Pray for them. We need more than luck this time, Darius said to Augustana, worried deeply about those he may well have sent to their deaths. As if she wasn't praying already. Hikatai barely had time to react when armed men covered head to toe in cloth came at her. They flashed black blades. He had more than before. No doubt veterans from Black Maw that worked for Darius. Loyal bastards were willing to die for him. So be it. If they offered their lives, she would take them. She blocked a few attacks by slowing momentum and clashing her staff against those black weapons. The force of her weapons seemed to be impacted less than spells, but still affected. The force of the blows sent them stumbling back. Others got clean stabs in her leg and one in her thigh. Anger flashed as more of them appeared and attempted to strike. How were they bringing in men? In Black Maw? The calculations were something a human couldn't do. What help did they have? She slammed her staff on the ground, causing a force pulse that sent those surrounding her skidding back. She launched a single bolt above her that split into dozens of silver-colored arcane splinters. Each of those arcane bolts shot out to the men close to her. Some men used their weapons to stop the attack from going through their throat, but the force was still considerable. Others had the arcane bolt go straight through their chest or throat. In those cases, the desperate men tossed their weapon to their allies and attempted to throw black knives at her before they breathed their last and hit the ground. She stopped more blades, and some of them came in for another strike. She clubbed 2 in quick succession. The force of the blow pulsed. When the diamond tip of her staff struck against flesh, the men seemingly flew away into the mountain in the distance, nothing but a stain on a rock. If they did not block with their black blades, that staff was an instant kill. She caused pulses to appear mid-air, knocking them off balance. She needed to kill them, here and now, all of them. Damned be the consequences and the bastards before her. Hikatai called upon deep ancient magic far above the sky. Black Maw made it difficult to be sure. However, the target of her magic was not Black Maw, they'd soon see. Down she called to the earth far above the sky. Gripping the loose stones far above the world, and with her staff pointed high in the air, she crashed it down to the floor. The spell was done, although the effect would remain to be seen. An arrow hit her, despite the fact she had regular defenses of Ars Momentus. The motherless scum must have dipped the whole arrow in that black stuff. The arrow was completely unaffected by her defense. Even worse, it was a shape which hooked into the target, making it difficult to remove. Even worse than that, she didn't have time to pull it out, even if she wanted to. The black blades and Meredith were upon her. Hikatai had little choice but to try to move to the edge of the maw while fighting. They weren't making it easy either. In a way, it was good she lived so long as a human. Humans regularly had to fight opponents stronger than them. They had to be smarter and cleverer. Hunting with the witchblades, she was in fact learning ways they'd kill even her. This gave her an appropriate mindset at guessing how they might attack her. It was simply how she might attack herself as Claire. They were biding time, trying to reduce her movements. They were now playing defensively now that they got a few cuts in. The rest was simply a matter of keeping her in Blackmaw. It wasn't a bad strategy. In fact, she'd give it passing marks to what she herself might do. Using arcane bolts which split in pieces once again, it was difficult for the black blades to stop all of the magical projectiles. Spray effects were best dodged. It was difficult to block. Those who could not dodge due to the numbers of allies to their left and right were killed. Every time their numbers thinned, they reshaped their formation and readied themselves. She had to admit they were well trained, until at last the effect of her spell was ready. Hikatai released a pulse of force and sent them back away from her. Her smirk was not a good sign for them. Burning rocks were falling from the sky, splitting against the friction in the sky. Blackmaw might have stopped magic, but it seemed those rocks were not magic. Magic may have directed their course, but the flames around them were not a spell. They lacked understanding, nor could they know how dangerous the blasts would be. 6 of the black blades, Meredith included, rushed in towards Hikatai. Meredith didn't know where those rocks might hit, nor what would happen, but he knew one thing. Hikatai would ensure she'd be fine. Whether the other 5 knew that was unknown. Those who ran closer found their motion weakened the closer they got to Hikatai. It was as if their bodies rebelled against them and would not let them move. The closer they got to Hikatai, the worse it got, until they were frozen in motion. Yet they could still see everything. The rocks hit the fields of Blackmaw. The force of the rocks falling from the burning sky blasted the entire area. It didn't matter if the rocks did not hit the men. The crashing force shook the earth, and a great shock-wave came from them. The force caused blood to fall from ears, bodies to twist and fall. Those who were not inside the safety of Hikatai's Ars Momentus were probably killed by the boom of the crashing rocks and the dirt that flew in all directions. The fire hit the floor and created an explosion, blasting all loose debris through everything and anything. There was no escape. Scipio was a significant distance away, but even he was not completely safe. The meteors from the sky hit the ground with such force, the debris tore through his clothes, and the force may have fatally ended him. Before he fell, he readied 2 arrows that fired not at Hikatai, but to the sky right above Hikatai. They were brightly colored flares, sending some kind of signal, to whatever hope it may have given Meredith. Some of the Ars Momentus did protect him from the worst of it, but even a small amount was fatal. Hikatai smiled. She removed the bulk of the enemies in her way. Dealing with 6 was far easier than 20. She lowered her Ars Momentus, allowing herself to move. Apparently, she herself could not move while in it, and it took tremendous effort to maintain in its place. Clashing her staff against black blade weapons, they were weakening, but to her horror, so was she. The storm was taking more of a toll on her. The dark dust was inside her. The nephelite churned in her blood now. She was wounded repeatedly with black weapons that cut through magical defenses. But no matter. If she got out of Blackmaw, she could slowly heal herself. Admittedly, they did well, but it was over. She beat back those that remained, felling them down with a pulse of force that knocked them hard against the floor. Then she started to run. The wounds in her legs slowed her, but after some paces she began to focus, removing little bits of nephelite from her system. She could not do much in the storm. Hikatai was weakened, physically and magically. She noted that the tired men followed her, but they weren't doing much better than her. At last the men couldn't keep following her. Only one did. She knew which one. A half-smile made play of her face, and she looked back to see Meredith still following her, using his swords to help him keep pace with her, almost like ski poles might be used. He moved against the harsh winds after her, but she had escaped them. Darius looked to Augustana. It's time. Then to Sai. Both nodded and respectively readied themselves. Darius looked to the observer. Teleport Augustana to the sun court on the edge of Blackmaw. Teleport Sai to the moon court on the edge of Blackmaw. The observer obeyed. Understood. Both of them flashed away with painfully bright light, leaving the observer and Darius alone in the room to observe the battle. The observer noted, "Shall I also send the message to Kenson?" Darius nodded. "Yes, send a message to Kenson and stand by." The happy little child voice made an affirmative tune before saying, "Understood." Augustana appeared before the Sun Court, who were ready with a force of what must have been no less than 1,000, staying a safe distance from the battle, but all the same a little too close to Blackmaw for comfort. "Ready your bows! Nock your arrows! The target is before you!" The male elf commander with red and blonde hair wore golden armor. He was ready for this. The commander yelled back to the Sun Elf army, made up of male and female. Mostly they were unarmored, since it would not be necessary for their task. They were mostly clothed head to toe, and in some of the luckier ones were wrapped in some anti-magical cloth. Whatever could be done in a short time to prepare them to survive the outskirts of Blackmaw. Their eyes could not be fooled by the flares in the distance. They could see well through that storm. The commander yelled out in Elvish, "These mortals seem to think your arrows can't hit their target. They said the wind is strong and the vision is poor. They say no one can make the shot. Let your rain of arrows make their mark. Fire!" Psy flashed into existence near the elves of the Moon Court, who quite separately took perch on another portion of the battlefield. Separating them was best. "It's time. She's barely in range, but she's in range." The Moon Elf smirked. "Then we'll hit her." She looked back to her army. The commanders were mostly female due to their higher magical affinity, but the soldiers were varied. They were armored and decorated to look beautiful and deadly. She said in Elven, "Let no one forget this day. The mortals have done their part. Show them that they were right to call us. Let us remember this force as the force that felled a goddess." They loosed their arrows, some of silver, some of cold iron, which the elves grudgingly shot. They flew into the storm like a swarm that blanketed the light of the sky. Hecate was getting closer now. Veins were forming on her face as the black sand went through her like a toxin. It got worse and worse, and the veins seemed to throb. Getting nearer to the edge of the storm, then she'd be able to last a little longer. She grit her teeth with realization. That coming shadow towards her was not part of Blackmaw. It was a hail of arrows. Those flares shot earlier was a signal, wasn't it? No doubt they had a host of men and women firing arrows endlessly. Trying to pin her down? No, this alone would not kill her. This was to keep her right where she was, expending every bit of magic she had just to prevent that many arrows from hitting her. They underestimated her to think she would stop just for arrows. Even in Blackmaw, she had ways to put an end to it. Far outside Blackmaw, she called upon the magic of the storm. It was difficult to control, but she was quickly causing winds outside the maw to kick and scream. She called upon the magic in her staff, creating a moderate-sized tornado. Typically, tornadoes did not last long, and did not touch ground long. She did not need long. The winds would cause their arrows to lose their mark, if the winds of the maw didn't already, although she was sure they'd keep shooting. The tornado was much as an attack as it was a defense. Elves, she could already tell, were quick to cast multiple dispel magics upon it, gradually weakening it. But as she readied defenses to hold back a volley of arrows, she activated once again Ars Momentus, slowing or even freezing arrows that got too close to her. Silver? That wouldn't work. Steel arrows? That did nothing. Then she felt it. Cold iron. Witch magic was weakened by cold iron. Even as a goddess, it could fly through her shield, especially here in Blackmaw. It was just as effective as those black weapons. Moon elves, she growled in realization. They were really so desperate as to use iron arrows. Cold iron. Darius must have been leading them. Yes, it would be like him to do that. She managed to stop some of the arrows, but not all. Realizing who she would have to take out first. She could easily wipe out that group of elves, and she intended to. After the volley slowed, she raised her staff and lowered her defensive magic. She needed every bit of focus in order to completely destroy the enemy army. Small spells would not do. She was going to make the very earth itself betray them. She held out her staff and opened her mouth to chant. Darius shouted, "Teleport me now, right next to her," placing a helmet on his face, revealing a full set of black armor, complete with a single blade. Teleporting him caused strain on the observer, but all the same he teleported. It was prepping that spell for a while now. Hecate opened her mouth to speak, to call upon the great power of the earth to create an earthquake and fissure. The fissure would swallow them whole. Brave as they were going to be the first to die. Then she felt pain. Intense pain in her hand and arm. Out of the corner of the eye, she saw Darius making a single chop motion against her wrists. Her eyes were wide. Full armor. How did he appear before her? Of course, he too had aid. He cut the hand that held her staff and grabbed it, pulling it as far from her as he was able and turning his body from her in order to block the arcane bolt she shot into his back. He went skidding, but the armor held. Arrows continued to rain. The quake shook the ground. For as little time she had to prepare such a mighty spell, she did it quickly and in the depths of Blackmaw. The staff resisted Darius, trying to go back to its master. It did not belong in his hand. It fought against him, yet he kept walking away as best he could, as Hikatai had to deal with a volley of arrows that came in waves. Darius was relatively safe with his armor against ranged spells, but the staff was a different matter. It pulsed against his hand, sending shock waves through his armor. He held fast, taking slow steps away from Hikatai and trying very hard not to lose his footing. As Darius made his way away from her, Meridus, who had somehow managed to live this long, tossed a single black blade into her leg muscle. He might have gone for a more fatal shot if he wasn't injured or the wind wasn't so strong. The black blade went through her magical defenses. She did her best to ignore the pain, and her body seemed to push the weapon out as she walked. It did not go in deep, probably because of how weak he was right now, but it slowed her, certainly. The other wounds were starting to take their toll. She could try to heal herself, but it did little good. She had too many arrows to stop, and she needed to get her staff back. As she moved, men came charging towards her. One of them wielded a large crossbow she recognized, and was surprised to see had some sort of artificial arm. "Sven," she muttered in surprise as a black bolt went flying into her side, tearing into an otherwise fatal opening. In her anger, she raised her hand, targeting the skies once again. This time, it wouldn't be she who needed to worry about her safety. She was going to drop enough to kill everything and everyone. The armies, the men before her, the hunters, everything. As those bastards said in the woods, everything dies. She did not have her staff, but she still had impressive hand-to-hand skills as men came to her. It was the witchblades, not one or two, but all of them. A host of men armed with cold iron and silver weapons, all of whom swore to put an end to the witch threat. Some of whom she taught herself. She caught Kenson. She saw Simon, Nathan, and Sven. She closed her eyes as even the old men came for her. Unaware of the burning death that awaited them, she smacked one of the younger hunters and summoned her cold old whip and spinning blade. If she did not have her staff, she would hold them off the old-fashioned way. In a way, she was proud of them. They really would kill her if she was a threat. She trained them well. She recalled sparring with Kenson. He got better. They all did. Memories flooded her, and the ever-lingering thought of what she should do became clear. She would do as a witchblade would do. She would fight with everything she had. Her face shifted to that of Claire, and her old clothes appeared. She cared less about living now. She spat blood, which seemed dark-colored. The arrows stopped for a moment. She threw her silver weapons towards the old man, which he deflected, then with a wave of her hand it went back to him. He did not block it. Kenson did. The old man whipped out an old silver and cold iron sword, which he ran through her. Sven shot her again. Kenson went for the tendons on her legs. Water and red fluid filled her eyes. Black started to fill the veins of her face. Her hands were shaking, but it was done. She was going to take them all out. She had been had. She couldn't move. The staff Darius held pulsed over and over, kicking and screaming to get back to its master. It let out such pulses that it could shatter bone and rupture organs. Darius held it ironclad, but the bones in his hands were breaking. His legs were hit with such force that his body was being liquefied from the inside. The black armor protected him some, true, but he was taking unavoidable damage from the staff of a goddess. The force seemed to cause his armor to shake, like being struck with a blunt object. His insides felt damaged. He fell at last to his knees, holding it still and wrapping his body around it as best he could as it eventually flew back to its master. She pointed the staff to the sky as she accepted swords, arrows, and other blows to the body. Hikatai knew she was dying here and now, but first she had business. She would hold on to life long enough to see what happened. Everything around her froze. She kept up an ars momentus which caused all to slow. She was surrounded by enemies trying to kill her. She looked at them. They were frozen still. Finally she seemed to reach the edge of Blackmaw, but it was too late. Far too late. Her body was finished, and significant damage had been done even to her as a goddess. She could not hold her life together. No amount of healing magic would save her. Perhaps she was fine with this in some way. She looked around her, deciding as a witch who she would curse with her last words. Of course, she could have cursed an entire army. That would have been within her power to do. She could curse the witchblades, her old friends. Most tempting of all, she could curse Darius, laying helpless on the ground in his armor. but then she turned behind her to see Meredith crawling towards her. She smiled at him. As a witch, I look to the ones closest to me, and I curse them. Laredo Meredith, as a witch I curse you. Your body will become a prison. You will live what days you have, never knowing peace. You will die a slow death until at last you will be unable to end yourself. Your children will be the death of you. Meredith could barely hear, but for some reason he had no problem hearing her. As everyone else was frozen, she reached down to kiss him on the lips. But as a goddess, I give you a blessing. I offer you salvation, the means to save this world. Use it or not, the choice is yours. Kenson and Sven, it has been an honor to know you. I am truly glad to be felled by your hands. Keep your blades sharp. She spat out some blood before handing Meredith the staff of the goddess. She didn't have much time. Inside this is the secret to draining magic from the dead and dying. It might be witches at first, but there is a means to take magic from all living things. The magic is within the staff. Learn it, master it. Everything dies, Meredith, but it doesn't have to end forever. Give the future a chance. Do what I couldn't. She kissed him again, letting blood and black fluid flow into his mouth. Even with her face turning warped and sickly, somehow she seemed beautiful, hauntingly so. A smile and tears filled her face. She collapsed to the ground as Claire, not Haikatai. Her skin seemed to be cracking with black outlines as if it were dried up dirt. Meredith looked up to see a now falling red meteor heading towards the army. He did not know what to do. Darius was on the floor and everyone was frozen. Frozen still. He looked at the staff and noticed it wasn't rejecting him. It was not trying to kill him like Darius. Perhaps he really could do something. He pointed the staff at the sky. The meteor came closer and closer. He grit his teeth and pointed the staff at it. He simply willed the meteor to stop. Without knowing or understanding the words, the Ars Momenta started to appear around the meteor. The hunters slowly freed themselves and grabbed Meredith, pulling him and Darius out of the storm. Meredith struggled to focus on one after another meteor. They were so vast, it was difficult to slow it down. But as he got more and more out of the storm, the meteor seemed to stay in the sky longer and longer. The red around it thinned. He focused more and more until at last it began to curve. It began to fall into multiple pieces, and it fell to the ground, crashing and making a thunderous blast. But it was not the fatal end that was prepared for them. He stopped as many as he could, stopping the largest and deadliest of them, then tried to stop the rest. It wasn't perfect, but it was all he could do. His vision slowly filled with black. He held on to the staff. Augustana ran to Meredith, who heaved and tried very hard not to die. Then she looked to Darius, who was bleeding a great deal inside his full plate of armor. "Get Scipio," he managed to say as he was being dragged out of Blackmaw by Sven. Scipio still lived, but it took time for Augustana to find him in a panic. She pressed him close when she found him ignoring the dark dust that surrounded him. She picked him up and ran back to the camp, hoping and praying to the 8 gods. Meredith, Darius, and Scipio's vision went completely black. They were dragged before elves who managed to survive a tornado, an earthquake, and remnants of a meteor swarm. Healers of all sorts ran up to them. There were men that ran cloaked into the storm to find the bodies of the fallen heroes. Different courts of elves looked over them, unsure of if they could make it, daring not to get close as the iron sand could kill them. Augustana gave the command, "Get them to the Gauss estate!" They needed to get not only them, but all those who were ill from the dark dust there. They left the staff in Meredith's hand. They let Darius stay in his armor, hoping none would see that Darius the Immortal had fallen. There were carts ready, and they were shipped out quickly to Shing, a host of men and elves guarding them while they were helpless. Others too were brought from the maw. Some of those who fought against the witch goddess yet lived. It was risky to bring them back, but they could not be left behind to die in that place. Impressive effort went into retrieving the weapons and bodies that were in Blackmaw. Some might even have been made sick simply retrieving the corpses. But not all were corpses. Some yet lived. These men were jokingly referred to as immortals, since they weren't dead now, they were never going to die.